So welcome everyone to our webinar this morning, Impacts of the Pandemic on Working Women. I'm Yvonne Liu and I work as a Communications Manager at Peabody, and I also co-chair our Gender Network, which is one of the 4 employee networks we have to make Peabody a more diverse and inclusive place to work. I'd particularly like to welcome those of you who are dialing in from other housing associations, including Notting Hill Genesis, Network Homes and MTVH. So today's webinar is part of a series of events that we're hosting at Peabody to mark International Women's Day, which was on Monday this week. And this webinar in particular is looking at how has the pandemic disproportionately affected some groups in the community, and in particular women. So the global economy we know has taken the worst downturn since the Great Depression because of the pandemic. And the gendered impacts of this have been really stark. And even though men are actually more likely to die of COVID, the pandemic's toll on employment has been much, much worse on women who are overrepresented in sectors that are hardest hit, like hospitality and retail. And for many of us who work at housing associations, there are a lot of women who work in frontline roles across care and support positions. And I know that a lot of those women have had to take on the furlough initiative in the UK. And as we start to move towards a recovery from the pandemic and we start to look towards new ways of working, it's really important for us to think about who's been worse affected by this pandemic and how can we support them differently to recover. And so we're joined today by Madeleine, who's a development director at Leesman, and is also incidentally a friend of mine from our graduate program. And Maddie's actually in Sydney at the moment, so it's a bit international today. And also joined by Jaqueline Frost, who is a creative director at Elevate Talent, who I was recently put in touch with. And the format for today is that Maddie and Jaqueline will both present on different angles of this topic, and then we'll move into an open Q&A. And we're going to start today with a bit of a poll about what you think about some of these issues. So Nikki, if you could load them up. So we just wanted to get a bit of a sense of what you thought about some of these issues. So the first is, do you think women in general have experienced more challenges than men to progress professionally since the start of this pandemic? So number 2, have you personally experienced challenges to progress professionally since the start of the pandemic? And 3, do you think we can do more to support women to progress professionally post-pandemic as we continue new ways of working? So I think you should all be able to see the results now. And to the first question as to whether or not women have experienced more challenges, interestingly, 94% of you have said yes, which is very overwhelming. I wasn't expecting nearly all of you to think that. The second question, which is actually quite heartening to me, particularly as a lot of my colleagues are on this call, have you personally experienced challenges to progress professionally since the start of the pandemic? Only half of you said yes and half of you said no, which to be honest, I'm really pleased about, because I think it goes a long way to show at Peabody, we've really gone to great lengths to try to support all of our colleagues, regardless of your gender, to remain engaged and supported and to progress. So the fact that we didn't get an overwhelming response for yes, I'm really pleased to see that. But of course, we still have a lot more we can do. And the last one, 100% of you said yes, that we can do better to support women as we progress, which is why I think conversations like this are so important and so helpful for us to think about what the wider implications are. What are other organisations doing? What sort of best practice can we borrow from? And to hear from experts like Maddie and Jaqueline as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Maddie to kick off.
Great, thank you. Just checking you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Hi everyone, thanks Yvonne, and thanks for having me today. As Yvonne mentioned, I work at Leesman. We are a UK-based firm, although as she mentioned, I'm currently in Sydney, and we look at global home working, office working, workplace trends, and specifically employee experience. So we've been around for around 10 or 11 years. However, 11 months precisely, 1st of April, we kicked off analysing home working, and given our decade worth of office working experience data, we've got a really good, strong data set to compare to. So what I'm going to do today is just pull out some of our data around specifically gender and demographics. All the data that I present is global. However, a good chunk of it is from Europe and the UK, but we do have a fair bit from APAC and North America as well. So keep that in mind. It's not UK specific, but the general trends are fairly reflective. Okay, so I'll start with the punchy one. So the top line before going into anything gender is that people are reporting, and I emphasize the word reporting because any survey is self-reported, that their productivity levels at home are higher than in the office. So as you can see there, we've got a large pool, 93,000 or so, but our decade worth of data gives us well over 800,000. So it is really robust data that we can compare here. So that is a 16% split, which I think is quite significant. I did actually look into the 81.4% reported productivity figure by gender, and actually it's very, very similar. So that's not anything I'll dive into today, but for reference, it is 82. So the top level is that home working is working better than we all, I think, expected this time last year. I think a lot of organisations thought it was going to be utter chaos, and arguably it was for some period of time, but countries globally now have really carved out a space and a way to work remotely, essentially a new way. So at Leesman, we have a set of 21 work activities, and these are standard. We ask these to everyone that completes our survey, and it gives us a huge ability to benchmark. So these are the 21 tasks. Now you're probably thinking they don't look like they're ranked in order, and no, they're not. For each task, we ask both about perceived importance and perceived support, and these are ranked by support. So the final right-hand side column. Now, we continue asking about these activities throughout COVID because the reality is that even though a lot of our jobs pivoted somewhat or changed in terms of our focus areas or funding cuts, etc., the actual activities that you do on a day-to-day basis technically did not change. It's just that you're most likely doing them in a home environment. So as we can see here, the things that are supported in the home working environment, those top couple things like planned meetings and routine tasks, audio conferences, as Yvonne mentioned, a lot easier to hold Zoom webinars sometimes than it is face-to-face. Phone conversations, individual desk, all these sorts of things are coming through as really highly supported. And I'm sure you've all engaged with family and friends over the last months and year over the discussion of will I ever return to the office and what does that mean for me? I think the general argument here is that there are a number of things that do work quite well at home, but there are also a number of things that are really lacking in that home environment. So if you jump to the bottom, some of these are not surprising. So spreading out paper, social interaction, and hosting people. However, the big one that I want to draw your attention to is fourth up from the bottom, which is learning from others. And this is where we are going to start to see a bit of a gender split. So learning from others essentially encompasses both formal and informal learning. And it's an activity that is not very well supported at home across the board, across industries. I think it's all safe to say that even though formal training courses can divert to an online method, it's very difficult to both carry out, but also to measure the informal, less tangible interaction and knowledge sharing that happens in an office, whether it's overhearing colleagues, the way they might position something, the response they might give to a client, any task really that you can absorb, I guess, when you're in that knowledge environment. So that's a really big one, and it's becoming bigger and bigger as this pandemic continues. I think for the first month or two, it didn't really matter if we weren't, training and learning, but as the time's gone on, this really plays significantly into career progression. And as we all know, that issue generally impacts women more than men. So I'm just going to break it down here by age group. So once again, this data, we're looking at about 93,000 responses as of about a month or so ago, so Q1 this year. And the trend that we are seeing globally is that those in the higher age groups are generally able to work from home or remotely a lot more successfully than those younger age groups. So on the right-hand side column here, we have what we call an index score, a Leesman Measurement Index, LMI. Don't worry about the meaning of the acronym, just look at the figure. It's between 0 and 100. And as you can see, although the numbers aren't hugely different, those in the above 45, above 55, and particularly above 65 as well, age groups are coping a lot better. Now, it is pretty easy to draw some parallels here as to what might be happening. First and foremost, those particularly in big cities like London in the younger age groups are most likely to be in house shares. They're probably juggling flatmates, lack of space, separation of space, really struggling to switch off at the end of the day, work-life balance. And as we get into these sort of middle two categories, far more likely to have caring and homeschooling responsibilities. However, once again, this is generalizing, but the trend is pointing to this. When we flick towards the 45, particularly the 55 and even the 65 and over age groups, we start to see those domestic responsibilities ease up somewhat, particularly homeschooling, particularly caring responsibilities, but also the likelihood of having a separate space that they can carve out as a workspace. So they're not necessarily in a bedroom with 3 other flatmates. They're more likely to have a spare room. Perhaps they've got adult children who have left home, things like that. The other thing that's really interesting, and this links back to what I was saying about progression, is that, and once again, this is a trend, not a specific rule, but generally as we hit the higher age groups, people are less keen, not always, but often less keen to, or have less desire, shall I say, to progress in their careers once they're sort of at that over 55, particularly over 65 mark. So the desire to know, to grow and share knowledge, progress in their careers both formally and informally, is less so as they get up, and perhaps not so much 45 to 54, but once you get over that 55 range. Granted, these are only trends that the data is indicating too. They're obviously, it is not the case for everyone, but it is something that we are seeing. The other split of the data that's really interesting to look at is time with organisation. And this is also one, as we know, that generally impacts women more than men as well. So we generally see regardless of home, even well before the pandemic was a thing, that those that are fairly new to an organisation, less than 18 months, report higher scores of their office experience. That's a standard statistic that we've been seeing as a trend for 10 years now. And then it generally dips away in the middle of someone's tenure. But then once they get to that 8 to 12, and particularly the over 12 year mark, they generally peak back up again. As some people say, they're lifers, i.e. with an organisation for life, or for a very long time at least. So that's the general trend that we see in the office data, and we're seeing the exact same data trend here in the home working experience data as well. So a lot of these people now will have joined their roles during the pandemic, during COVID. And so they're obviously probably trying to front up with a fairly optimistic view, but then that really does dip off as people stagnate in their careers. And once again, we know with lots of additional domestic responsibilities for women and the need for perhaps maternity leave, domestic responsibilities, etc., these issues are only going to be more prevalent in that sort of middle grouping. Okay, now the single biggest factor that our data has shown us around the ability and the success of working from home, so the overall home working experience, is the type of space that one has access to. So we divide this into 3 sections, which we've always asked. So a dedicated workroom or office, so essentially a study if you're lucky enough, a dedicated work area but not a separate room, and a non-specific location like a dining room table. So as you can see, the experience score differs significantly, and this is global data, but this is a trend that we are seeing with absolutely every client, big clients, small clients, geographic agnostic as well. But those with a dedicated space, understandably, it makes perfect sense, have a far better home working experience. It's actually quite high, hitting on 80, which is what we would deem to be high performing. Those with a dedicated space, but not a separate room, so for example, a table in a dining room area, a little bit lower, but those that are really struggling, as we know, are those with a non-specific location. Now, granted, we can't prove this, of course, but through a lot of our conversations over the last year, we're hearing from a lot of leaders in the HR and workplace fields that women are feeling like if they only work 3 days a week, or if they perhaps are less senior than their male partners in some situations, that they feel like if there is the luxury of a study or a spare room, it should automatically go to them. And that's a conversation that we've had time and time again over the last 12 months. We don't technically advise on that, but it's something that's reported back to us a lot when we present this data. And it is a real concern, particularly as most of us in most cities can't afford spare rooms and that sort of thing. And organisations certainly can't build garages and home offices for people to have that space. So a really difficult one that the organisation has little control over in many ways, but it's very, very reflective of the overall experience. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, we actually have globally a pretty even split here. So it's not that most people fall into one category. However, it is worth noting geography. So a lot of our cities like London and cities in Europe that are very heavy in apartment living, etc., far more likely to fall into here. But interestingly, I'll mention this, I know no one on the call is from North America, but with the exception of New York City, we always see in the Americas 60-70% of people falling into that top category. And granted, it's just because the housing is significantly bigger, there's far more space. So this is fairly reflective globally of what we see in the UK, but it is interesting to keep geography in mind. When you get to some cities in parts of some regions, parts of APAC, where you've got multiple generations under one roof, that can have a positive effect in terms of their sharing the load or the burden of caring and domestic responsibilities, but it also can cause bigger issues in terms of the ability to carry out a role or a job successfully. Okay, so essentially this is a comparison of those same 21 activities. So I won't read them out one by one, and this is being recorded and we can share this, but essentially at the bottom here, we have those things that are working very well at home, and at the top, the things that are far better supported in the office. So learning from others, as I mentioned, it's almost an inversion of what we saw before in terms of office versus home. Okay. So I wanted to dive into this, which is where we start to get onto some of the gender-specific issues. So within those three sections that I mentioned, the homework setting, so dedicated workroom or office, dedicated work area, and non-specific location, we then ask the question of who is with you during the current home working experience. So people can select more than one because many people will have a partner and children or dependents. But consistently, the data, with the exception of one figure on lines 4 and 5, 77, 78, the data is almost magically top to bottom from a dedicated room with no one at home, then onto partner, great, children, fine, but you've still got a dedicated space. Same for partners, family and children dependents. But then as we continue to go down with those settings and merging in the other factor of who is with you, we start to see those figures in the right-hand side columns drop. So from the 80s to the 70s and down into the 60s. So it comes back to what we're seeing consistently, that the work setting is crucial, but it also plays a big role in terms of who you have with you. Now, granted, this is the reported work experience score, but we could also argue when you're looking at things like loneliness and isolation, that perhaps those living alone at the moment might be struggling in other areas. So we don't want to paint everyone with the same brush and say that actually they're fine, they're living alone and they have a dedicated study, because they might be struggling elsewhere. But in terms of the ability to perform their role between, say, 9 and 6, tick, after hours, they might be far more, it's struggling far more, I should say. Okay, so now we start to look at gender. Now, here in the grey, we have male, and here in the blue, we have female. Now, interestingly, this shows that females are outperforming males regardless of work setting. Now, before anyone says, and I always have to stop people when we talk about this data, oh, well, what does that mean for, women in the workforce? Well, actually what it means is that generally women are adapting far better. They're able to multitask a lot better. They're able to get on with the juggle, shall I say, of the pandemic a lot better than men. And I shouldn't really say a lot better, because some of these scores are fairly similar. But that is the sort of the overarching statement that this data is indicating to us. And as I mentioned, this is data over the last year. So it is fairly robust now to be able to make those conclusions. So that really brings us back to not, oh, well, women are fine. They're absolutely not fine at the moment. It's more just that they're able to multitask, take that trust, make it work, shall I say, and juggle that load. There is one point that has come up a couple of times with many clients, which is around domestic responsibilities. And when they are at home, one positive, I'm not saying there's loads, but one is the ability to use, say, commute times and things like that to undertake domestic duties. Now, obviously, as we would all say, that shouldn't fall specifically with any females. However, the reality is that we think that this data is pointing to that ability to multitask, as I mentioned. So interesting there. It might look like they're coping. It's probably correct that they are coping better. It doesn't mean that they are okay. It just means that they've probably got a few more coping strategies than male counterparts. The other really interesting trend that we're doing a little bit of research on is and we have read up quite a bit on this academically, is around communication styles. And I am generalizing here, but we see in a lot of academic studies that a stronger preferred method of communication amongst males is face-to-face. And in the time in between those face-to-face activities, there will often be less interaction virtually, so texting, phoning, etc. Statistically, females are more likely to keep that contact up throughout a week or a month. So during a pandemic, when females are not seeing their friends all the time because we are all in lockdown, they are more likely, I'm not saying they're okay, absolutely no one's really okay at the moment, but I shouldn't say that sitting here in Sydney, but it's more that their communication style allows for these situations, rather men are often struggling in that sort of work socializing sense. So they will really socialize in the office face-to-face, but they're unlikely to text someone on a weekday evening and just check in after, see if they've had a rough day, and that goes for friends and colleagues. So the communication style and approach is definitely playing a role here as well. Also, we believe, based on the academic research. Okay, so I just wanted to leave. I'm just checking my time. Perfect, cool. I do have time, or Yvonne, actually, we can go to questions after, or however you want.
Yeah, let's save them for the very end, and we can have a long Q&A at the end.
Perfect. Great. So that's where we are essentially. The one thing I will mention though at the end is the magic 5-letter word trust. Which is an interesting one, because essentially 12 months ago, most of us were handed a fair bit of trust from our employers and told to go and work from home. And we do believe that a lot of these figures are perhaps using rose-tinted glasses, in that people in the future do want to be able to have the ability to work flexibly. And I know many organisations are at the forefront of that already, and now post-COVID will be even more so. But I do just want to caveat all of the data by saying that we do believe that a lot of people don't want that trust snatched back. So the policies and all that will, flow on from there. Also, we hope, but we really truly believe that it won't be the same world of work that we left.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thanks, Maddie. I'm already feeling sorry for myself because I work in my bedroom. Maybe I can use that as I can explain poor productivity to my manager because of that, because I don't have a dedicated workspace.
Statistically, it's true.
Well, yeah. I mean, stats don't lie, do they? Now over to you, Jaqueline.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I just would like to be able to share the screen if I can, if I can get permission to do so, please.
Yeah, you should just be able to hit share screen in the bottom, and I think that should.
Yeah, it didn't. It was saying somebody else had to unshare theirs first, so I not allowed to jump in. Here we go, and here we go. So yeah, no, that it's fascinating, Maddie. I really enjoyed that. In actual fact, on the back of a few things, I know that before I go into what I'm about to share about the current situation in 2021, I would like to mention that I remember hearing years ago the big issues, big crisis happen probably about every 10 years. This one happens to just be a major one, and as Yvonne said, since the Depression we haven't had such a big impact in the economy, but about every 10 years we do have issues. So we've had the emerging market crisis, 10 years with the financial crisis. They always impact women more than men. That's the research shows that regularly throughout these different historic events. But the thing I also heard for the very first time over 20 years ago, when it was the emerging market crisis, was a boss turned around to me and said, well, you know what you do in bad times, don't you? He said, hire women. And it's so interesting to see that from your research, that still seems to be true when it comes to issues. Women adapt quicker. Women seem to. So I'm about to share, some of the downsides of this and the impact that's had. But there are positives definitely that have come from this, that definitely demonstrate that we have a role, an important role, and society needs. And so we need to get this together to make sure that this is getting the attention, and what better way than International Women's Day, because it's a great opportunity for everyone to celebrate the success that we women have achieved in the workplace, and also the contribution that we make. And gender equality has been so high on the agenda the last 10 years, yet the pace has been so slow. And as I said, many instances in the past, but of course, COVID-19 threatens to reverse many of these important gains, and the damage from the pandemic and unintended fallout from government response and recovery policies is disproportionately being felt by women. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll run you through some of these, the ways that women are carrying the greater burden of COVID-19, and also how we as individuals can choose to challenge this and to limit some of this negative impact that is happening. So we have to start from the very beginning and see what the situation was before we entered into this pandemic. So across the globe, women earn less, we save less, we hold less secure jobs, we are more likely to be employed in what is called the informal sector. We have less access to social protections and are the majority of single parent households. And our capacity to absorb economic shocks is therefore less than that of men. And back in March last year, entire sections of the economy were ordered to be shut down by the government to prevent the virus from spreading. And as this image shows here on the slide, these workers are disproportionately female. So this is in the UK. The image here shows that women were about a third more likely to work in a sector that was shut down compared to men. So approximately 17% of female employees were in such sectors, whereas only 13% of male employees. And on top of this, another layer is that mothers in the UK were 1.5 times more likely than fathers to either quit their job or lose their job during the lockdown. And this, I do apologize, I seem to flip through. Yes, now this source is from the HMRC, and it shows the furlough, so the total number of employment by furlough. So from July 1st, more women have been furloughed than men, so it's 2.74 million women compared to 2.57 million men. And as you see, as it's gone down, there is still that gap. There's still women are being furloughed more than men. It's very proportionate down, it continues, but still that big difference of women on furlough compared to men. And so, okay, we've looked at sectors that are in lockdown, the furlough, but what about sectors that are not in lockdown? What's been the impact there? Well, this graph shows the ability to work from home among workers in sectors that are not in lockdown. And this is quite interesting. This kind of, crosses over to what Maddie was just sharing as well, how that's worked, how that's been set up. And clearly it is those with higher levels of education and earnings who are more likely to be able to carry out their work activities from home. However, as you can see, men are more likely to be in occupations that are less amenable to home working, meaning that a lot of the homeschooling, the childcare, perhaps supporting vulnerable family members is more likely to be undertaken by women. And we've had a quick look now at the UK, but what about the rest of the world? Are women taking a greater impact in other countries too? Now, of course, most people's lives, male or female, lives and work have been negatively affected by the crisis. And analysis shows that overall women's jobs and livelihoods around the globe are also more vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the scale of this inequality is quite striking. So I looked at data trends from unemployment surveys in the United States and India. Now, it's not possible everywhere. These are countries where gender disaggregated data is available. And female job loss rates due to COVID are about 1.8 times higher than male job loss rates globally. So that's probably about 5.7% versus 3.1% respectively. Now, at a country level in the United States, women make up 46% of workers before COVID-19. However, unemployment data indicates that women make up 54% of the overall job losses to date. And similarly in India, very different country. You probably couldn't get two different economies and structures. Women in India made up 20% of the workforce before COVID-19, but the unemployment survey suggests that they actually account for 23% of overall job losses. So the next question is obviously what's causing this? What's the problem? And it does seem that the gendered nature of work across industries explains that, explains about a quarter of the difference between job loss rates for men and women. And the lack of systemic progress to resolve other society barriers as well for women also explains an awful lot of it too. Now, on top of the current structure of the workforce, people say polled over 6,000 people nationwide, this is in the UK, to ask about gender bias amid the pandemic. Had that changed? And as you can see here, about 35% of women faced discrimination amid pandemic-related job loss and pay cuts. And 45% of Britons fear COVID-19 will further widen the existing gender pay gap. And I'm sure many of you remember when the lockdown, the issue started occurring in March last year, the UK government did something very interesting and actually decided to say that the gender pay gap reporting for 2020 was no longer necessary. So it's a really mixed message there, because on the one hand, this is an important topic and there's a huge amount of value on women in the workplace, women as the purchasing power women have. But the very first sign of trouble, the first thing they do is say, okay, no need to do the gender pay gap reporting this year. We'll take that off your plates, because this is so important. And we would have had a much better view of last year compared to this year had that reporting been done. So it's a real loss of data as well to track what's happened there. And in general, reports of the impact of coronavirus on men and women in the UK have been repeatedly skewed towards men, and that was a report by a committee of MPs on the UK government policies. And they've also repeatedly failed to consider the labour market and caring inequalities faced by women, amongst many others. So I think, at best, there's been a degree of institutional thoughtlessness about the impact of the decisions made by the government on women. And I had to share this next slide because this absolutely made me laugh last year. I don't know whether many of you remember this, but there was a war of eyebrows versus beards. So as you can see from this slide, it shows what was banned and what was not banned. And you can see on the left-hand side, the male side, only one element was banned, and that was full kind of shaping of beards, whereas on the right-hand side, any women's facial treatments were banned. So July 4th, beard trims can be done if the barber avoids activity in the high risk zone, and the majority, of the time, they're avoiding eyes, nose, and mouth to complete the service, and that should be limited to things like beard trims, thinning, removing bulk or length. However, at the same time, women were not allowed to go and have any facial treatments or any hair removal treatments. That wasn't allowed until the 14th of August, so over a month later, and that was hugely delayed compared to other sectors too. And what initially seemed like a cautionary measure actually seemed to reek of sexism after it's discovered that beard trimming had been allowed for quite a long time. And despite the government's statements about the importance of kick-starting the economy, the UK beauty industry actually contributes around £30 billion annually. That's a huge number. That is bigger than motor vehicle manufacturing and publishing industries. It's a huge part. So it's a huge industry that was suffering because of this continued lockdown. Now, I want to give you a comparison, because perhaps some of you are thinking, okay, well, that would have been on data. How much have you heard about data and the science, and the government going to follow the science on this? Okay, go across the water to Denmark. Hairdressers reopened. They were the first to reopen, with dentists and driving schools long before cafes, restaurants. So very much the other way around compared to the UK. And was it based on science? Well, definitely, because the decision in Denmark was based on advice from SSI, Infectious Diseases Institute. So it was based on science. So any of you can think of what the difference could be? Well, it's very, very simple. I don't know how many of you have met the Danish Prime Minister, but let me introduce you. Her name is Mette Frederiksen, and 40% of MPs in Denmark are female. And actually, it went to a vote in Denmark how they were going to open. It was something that was put across their parliament, and a vote was taken, and this is how the vote went. Of course, that didn't happen at all. And I think the thing that really hit me with this is that as part of my job, I coach a lot of senior women. And I started to hear from women in July saying that, I'm starting to not want to be shown on Zoom calls in meetings. I don't want people to see me because this is not, I don't think I'm presenting myself in the best way possible, professionally. It is socially acceptable for men to have facial hair. It is not socially acceptable for women. It's not the same thing. And so my clients telling me I'm becoming increasingly self-conscious because I understand my appearance is not what I want it to be, and I'm becoming very self-conscious about this. And one client even reminded me of something that Hillary Clinton said years previously. She hadn't realized how much hair matters. When she was running for her various positions in office, the press commented on how she looked and how her hair, it's not so much men don't have to have that look. They don't get that same feedback, and it's not given the same attention. So as I was saying, more women throughout the globe are employed in sectors hardest hit by COVID-19. But for the moment, job retention schemes are perhaps masking the full effect of the economic fallout of this. So unemployment, we don't know what's going to come. It is likely that the worst is still to come for women. And we mentioned that 45% said that they fear that COVID-19 will widen the gender pay gap. But that is actually both men and women on that survey. But according to the report, actually 55% of women are worried that the pandemic will widen it further, compared to 45% of men. So women are definitely more concerned than men about the widening of the gender pay gap. And a piece of data I did dig for, but we just couldn't find it. And we wanted to dig into those numbers a little bit more. What I was interested to learn was actually about men that took this vote. So take opposite gender couples, that should concern them about the existing gender pay gap widening too, because it affects them too. If their partner is not being paid or not being able to achieve promotions or go through a corporate, structure to get a higher salary, then that has an effect on the household income too. That number I could not find. So, but if anybody does happen to see anything, do please let me know. And in the UK, when it comes to promotions or pay cuts over the last month, many women have said they have been discriminated against or treated unfairly compared to their male counterparts. So a little bit of that old school view that, men need to be paid more, they have a family to support. So it seems to be, or they will have in the future, seems to still be a bit ingrained in society. So over a third of women claimed that they had faced discrimination and COVID-related job losses and pay cuts. And additionally, around 42% said that they felt they had been at more of a disadvantage of losing their job than their male colleagues during the pandemic, which is again why I'm so interested to hear from Maddie about the fact that women have adapted better. So we've adapted better. We seem to have done a much better job of turning this around, yet we're being penalised at higher rates. So something is going wrong there. But of course, there is work to be done. According to research, if the OECD is to completely recover from COVID-19 by 2030, progress towards gender equality needs to be twice its historical rate. So the current work structure, we have to remember the current work structure was created in the 1950s, when men went to work and women stayed home to care for the children, look after the household. 70 years later, this is simply not how things are. So prior to the pandemic, there was the highest rate of female employment ever. 73% of women between 16 and 64 were employed. And that's actually up 53% compared to the 70s. So it's a huge jump. By comparison, just so that, to put this on perspective, 80% of men aged 16 to 64 are employed. And so it brings to the point where, and this is a great number, that 70% of Britons believe companies must have work policies that enable equal parenting. And again, there's good things that will come out from this without a doubt, because now that we've all experienced a scenario of working from home, juggling, homeschooling, childcare, other responsibilities, it really has put the spotlight on the fact that the work structure is no longer able to continue the way it has. It needs to adapt, it needs to change. Now, what about the pandemics and the effect the pandemics at home. So of course, large increase in childcare and homeschooling carried out at home meant that parents have been faced with huge additional demands for their time. And the figure in this slide shows how these are being shared within the couple. Now, this is opposite couple households. It shows how mothers and fathers spend their time in domestic and professional responsibilities depending on their work status. Now, I don't think it will be a shock to any of you to see that mothers are always doing more childcare and housework than fathers, regardless of working status. Furthermore, mothers who work for pay do fewer hours and paid work than fathers do, but the difference does not offset gaps in childcare and housework. That said, despite doing less than mothers, fathers too are doing huge amounts more childcare. There is still that gender gap, though, in amount of time. And also, as you can see from the graph, when women do more of the childcare and housework, they do it regardless of whether they actually work or not. But what also you can see, it's interesting in this research, is that a non-working father will actually do less childcare and housework compared to a non-working mother. Now, a very, very simple question. So yes, I said IWD this year is choosing to challenge. And so we have to think about this in the bigger picture too. Because what about how we challenge ourselves? What can we be doing? You know, we all have a power here. We all can participate as companies and as individuals. And so I'd like to ask just a very, very simple question. This here is a number, £1.5 million. How many of you, if I said, okay, would this money be helpful to you? How many of you would say yes? Can't imagine many of you will say no, if I'm very, very honest. So if you are thinking no, please hold it and let's share it later when we get to questions points. It'll be interesting to see why. And how many of your husbands will say yes? And so really this is the whole sort of theme behind International Women's Day. It's been going on since 1911. You know, what can you do to challenge yourself this year? What can we do to step up? What can we be doing, you know, about that home life as well? So where do I get this number from? Because it's just not about having courage at work to step up and challenge. It's also about having the choice to challenge and call out inequality when it's happening at home. So where have I got this £1.5 million from? Where is it coming from? How are we going to get this? Well, it's very, very simple. Just taking a salary of £50,000 and perhaps the next year, say working next 30 years, say an age of 35, that's where that £1.5 million comes from. Now, some might be thinking, yes, but I get taxed, etc., etc. Yes, of course you do, but also you would also get pay rises in that time. There are also additional benefits such as pension, healthcare, insurance, blah, blah, that's not covered there. It's just a very powerful number. So this is what you are worth. And I don't know, of course, all your personal situations, but given the slide I've just shared before and the differences in housework and childcare, the probability is that the female of the household, you are doing a larger share of the unpaid work in the house. And there's some very interesting research about this. It's been done, a book that came out last year by Brad Johnson and David Smith called Good Guys. It says how men can be better allies for women in the workplace. And they interviewed women that said that gender equality at work had to actually start with men becoming equal partners at home. Real allyship and gender partnership demands that men do their fair share of household chores, childcare, transportation, for-child activities, emotional labour of planning and tracking activities, and also supporting their partner's career. And when men genuinely enact partnership at home, it actually accelerates gender equality in 3 different ways. So first of all, women with equal partners at home are more successful at work. The second way is fathers who are equal domestic partners role model equity for their children. And this shapes expectations for our future workforce. That's a very important step. That role model element is really key here. And finally, men who equally share unpaid work at home aren't afraid to ask for and talk about why they need flexibility in their work schedule. This will only change. We will only manage to make change if we are all asking for that change and we're all demanding that change. That's a really key part of it. If it remains only women, it remains a women's issue. And this is not a women's issue. This is a parents' issue. This is a work issue. This is a world issue. This is a human issue. It is not a women's issue. And we need to move away from the fact that the thought that all this is, oh, these are female issues. They are not. And as we like it normally in Elevate, we like to finish our sessions with a final thought. And I just really love this final thought from J.K. Rowling. And she says, you do not need to change, you do not need magic to change the world. We carry all the power we need inside ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better. And that to me really is back to the theme of International Women's Day of choose to challenge. We can all challenge, we can all take a role, we can all participate, we all have the power. Let's not give it away. So thank you very much for listening to me. Hopefully I kept within the time there, Yvonne. And
you did. Thank you so much, Jaqueline.
I should just quickly stop sharing my screen. There we go.
That was great. Super interesting as well to get that global perspective, but also I found some of the slides quite depressing.
Well, it is, and I think there are times where this is often the balance that we do have to manage when we talk about this topic, because it's important to see the data, but it's also to highlight. And I think, as I said during the presentation that Maddie mentioned, that women actually have adapted better to this. So let's be pushing those great messages too, and making sure that the contribution that we are making is getting recognition. There has been under recognition throughout the years of the way women contribute to society, and that definitely needs to change.
Absolutely. And as we all know, even in our jobs, without the data, you can't measure. You don't know when things getting better or getting worse, and it's important to be honest about that.
Yeah, what gets measured gets done. Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah.
Actually, and on that note, I might ask the first question to you, actually, Jaqueline. One of our attendees has asked, why do you think the government so quickly cancelled the gender pay gap reporting in the UK last year?
Because they saw it as a very easy way to lift the burden of what was about to happen. It was very short-sighted. It was a very short-sighted decision because they saw an easy way, and unfortunately they show their hand, because basically what they're telling you deep down is they don't believe it's important. Because if we believe something's important, we fight for it, don't we? I mean, I know I do. If I don't think something's important, I'd be like, okay, I'm not bothered. I'm not going to fight for it. So they really genuinely don't see the importance of it. And I think what's even more worrying is that nobody around them said, hang on a minute, this is important. We're not doing this. And nobody came out afterwards from the cabinet to say, I did not agree with this. I thought this is a really bad idea, which again goes back to representation in the cabinet. Are women properly represented in the cabinet? Are we properly represented in Parliament? And the answer is,
I really noticed the silence in the media, actually, because when I found out it wasn't required last year, I thought, that's weird. How come I haven't read about this? There was very little talk about it in mainstream media. Very little reporting.
Who's the control behind the mainstream media? Who's the dominant factor there? Nobody thinks it's a problem. Nobody thinks it's a problem. I've been the single female. My background, 7 years, is actually investment banking. I've been coaching and training for the last 10 years now. Before that was investment banking. I was frequently the only female in the room. And when matters were important, I absolutely sat there and highlighted it until I got at least some sort of sliver of recognition from the rest of the team to realise this is not something that it's not important. They just didn't see the importance. And I always did my very best to help them see the importance and what they were missing. So yeah, and I've been there, so I know what it's like. It's incredibly frustrating.
I have to say, I find Peabody an incredibly inclusive workplace, and yet I still find myself as an agitator for change, because we can always do better. We have a gender pay gap. It's quite complex at Peabody because of the sectors that people work in. But even in a place like Peabody, I still find that I need to agitate, I need to make noise, I need to point out when things can be improved, rather than sitting quietly and just kind of accepting that, well, it's okay, it's fine mostly.
No, I completely agree with you. In actual fact, the way I would frame it in my own personal examples of that was over the years of my career, was that I would turn around to the group of people on my team and say, if I go along with this, I'm complicit, and so if this was say something, and I know it sounds extreme and very dramatic, this is a murder, I'd be an accessory, and I know it's not a murder, and of course we don't think in those terms, but if this were a murder that you were all hatching and I sat there and didn't say anything, then I'm an accessory, and I would be found guilty in a court of law, and I'd go to jail, not for as long, but I would still go to jail. And that was the thing with me, is that I just couldn't be complicit. So even if I didn't think I was going to get anywhere with it, even if I didn't think that, I would absolutely say, for the record, I want this added. I want it marked that I do not agree with this. I am not on board with this. I think this is not the right decision. It's not been properly thought through. Whatever it was, I would make sure that that at least my objection was registered. And actual fact, what tended to happen over time was the things I was raising the objections would come back to bite. And it took a while, but eventually, more and more, and it was like a ripple effect, more and more of the team, more and more of my colleagues did start to sort of listen. And they were mostly all older than me and more senior than me, because when I was joining on the executive committee, I was the only female. I was worked for an American bank. I was the only Brit. They were all much older than me. I know there's a very strange thing to say, but also a lot taller than me. I'm 5'7", 170, so I'm not short. But it's actually there's a presence to it as well. One of the guys was 6'4" and had rowed for his college, Ivy League college. He'd rowed for, he was a huge presence. So, there's a huge amount of factor in play there. And, it does feel so I began to see that my objections were, and they would more and more start to say, okay, actually, let's get your viewpoint, because you always have something interesting to add, was the word they used to use, interesting to add, which is,
Absolutely. Maddie, we've got one for you. They've got quite a few questions actually. So one of our attendees has asked, based on your findings, what do you think employers could do to help employees improve their productivity?
Yeah, interesting question. And I'm assuming that they're not asking specifically in regards to the home or, the office environment, because at home, self-reported productivity is significantly higher than the office. But the answer in both spheres is going to come down to middle management. And I think that this pandemic has really exposed good middle management from poor middle management. And particularly what I mean by that is people have been forced to shift from very traditional presenteeism-based management methods to far more output-driven management methods. And I think that's a big, some people have done it fantastically and some organizations have done it fantastically, but I think there's a lot of individuals and organizations who have done it very poorly. And I think the pandemic's really exposed that. And I think that's a huge cultural piece that will need to be addressed. And actually, ironically, it comes back to, I think there's two parts of being a good manager. And one is obviously the formal learning, and that's great. But there's definitely a huge knowledge share, intangible piece around observing how others manage. And back to the point around learning from others, suffering a lot. If you're not around other teams and see other managers, how are you going to develop and grow into you can do all the training courses under the sun, but if you can't sort of observe others that you admire and respect, then that's a big one.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that was one of the key drivers, is improving middle management, but it also is just another reason yet again that we need to accelerate women into leadership roles, because then we have more women supporting others through that pipeline. And as you say, if middle managers are making that much difference to productivity, you will see an aggregate change across the organization. It's just, it would have to happen. On the back of that question, sorry, did you have something else to add?
No. Perfect.
Someone else has asked, related to that, what workplace changes or policy or culture can we make?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of policy, all of the things that you'd expect, and a lot of people had a lot of organizations had some fairly poor policies in place with regards to all things that the pandemic's brought up and identified. So everything from flexible working that their tech didn't support, caring responsibilities, just flexibility in general. And there's a whole bunch of policy areas that lie under that. But in terms of the workplace and cultural piece, obviously the physical workplace, I'll get to that in a minute, but in terms of the cultural piece, I think there's a huge amount of shifts that have already happened in terms of expectations, and it does ironically come back to that midwife management piece a little bit again, where the big question that I'm chatting to a few people about at the moment is, will peak hour be a thing of the past, particularly from a hygiene perspective, but also the why are we all cramming ourselves onto tubes between 8 and 9 when actually that makes no sense. It elongates all of our journeys, makes them far less uncomfortable, and then on top of that there's some hygiene concerns. So will we struggle, not necessarily struggle, but straddle our days with school hours for those that have children at school ages, and will peak hour be gone? So I generally think those sorts of cultural shifts will play out organically over the next 12 months, but I also think there'll be a sort of definitely a policy catch-up game, depending on where the organisation was pre-COVID. And then in terms of the workplace, obviously there's a huge amount of, actually one thing I should mention is that when and I didn't have this in my presentation, but one thing that we're really picking up on is that the desire to return to the office, say 3, 4 or 5 days a week, is entirely driven, or very much driven, by the experience that the individual had in the office when they left. So those people that had a fantastic experience, really great culture, they're hugely missing it. They actually have a desire to return 3, 4, 5 days a week. But there's some really stark data coming out that we're seeing around those that either don't want to go back at all or only want to go back 1 or 2 days. And there is a piece to play in terms of what they've got at home and that experience, but it's also hugely impacted by what they are returning to, i.e. what they left. So if that environment isn't fostering their needs, it's not looking after the things that they want and they value in their lives, then their desire to return is a lot less. In terms of the physical practicalities, there's a whole bunch of things that we could go into in terms of everything from breakout rooms and relaxing spaces and making things more accessible, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hadn't really thought about it in terms of people who didn't want to return to work as much. So for me, classic extrovert, I've improved. I'm finding this full-time remote working really tiring because I'm not getting the in-person interaction that I need, that makes me excited. It's just not the same over a screen. And again, I'm not going to lie, we didn't have the most fantastic office of people necessarily physically, but the people, for me, having that interaction was so important for the way that I work and my personality that, I'm really looking forward to going back a few days. I mean, it's not going to happen for some time, but at least 3 days for me personally. I can't wait for that.
And it's really interesting. There's 2 schools of thought that are going on in the industry about that, shall I say, rebound at the moment once we're allowed to. And one is very much that people, exactly like yourself, that are like, absolutely, I want to go in all the time, or not all the time, but as much as I possibly can, like, that's where I want to be. But then there's a school of thought of, actually, I've become so used to this, and I have blurred the boundaries between personal and work. And that's not necessarily a good thing in terms of switching off, but people have realized that they can do a load of washing during the day and they can get deliveries and have the plumber around, et cetera, et cetera. So now there needs to be a driving reason to return to the office. So if you ask me, it's a personal opinion, I won't say this from Leesman's perspective, but I think the impromptu after pub drinks that you get so regularly in London will be very much a thing of the past, because people need a reason to go in. So it's either they've got a face-to-face meeting that's important, they're meeting a friend after work, they've got a dentist appointment in the city or near their work. There actually has to be a reason to leave home and commute and go to the office. So that spontaneous, it doesn't even need to be a drink, that spontaneous coffee, impromptu plan, shall I say, will definitely be, I believe, a thing of the past, sadly.
Jaqueline, did you have a comment there? I think I saw.
Yes, well, there's 2 big things there you've mentioned, which are absolutely correct. So yeah, the difference in going to the office is definitely, it's a personality thing, extrovert versus introvert. And there seems to be this view in the world, again, with various biases the world has, is that an extrovert is a good thing, an introvert's a bad thing. I have lost count of how many clients said to me, my problem is I'm an introvert. I have never once heard anybody say, my problem is I'm an extrovert. I've never once had that said. And I can think of many extroverts where their problem is they are an extrovert, because they are unbearing. They really are. They're overwhelming. They're at you and over you, like, oh my goodness, give me some space. I equally am an extrovert. And I've never said, oh, my issue, it just makes me smile so much. And the other thing as well, on your point, Maddie, there, which I think is absolutely right, is that impromptu plans, they get together, oh, let's walk out to Starbucks together, that kind of thing. Again, that very much plays to the male way of operating too. You know, those kind of casual catches up. And you know, that's not to say that they shouldn't do that. Of course, you know, they're completely entitled to do that. But what it creates an imbalance. And also I'll never forget one time saying to my male colleagues who were going for a drink after work, I said, oh, I'll come. And they all just stopped and looked at me like I'd said, I'm about to shoot you all. They all looked at me and I said, well, yeah, can I not come? And they're like, well, yeah, okay. And then on one occasion later, I actually got invited with them. I thought, oh, how nice is that? And then I found out later, the only reason they invited me was we had to get a cab and it was raining, and London cab drivers aren't great for stopping for groups of men. But I was a group, so I got them the cab. So I was brought in for a purpose. They weren't being kind. I had a use for them. You know what I mean? So it's exactly that kind of thing. That it's precisely that, the impromptu, but also the time. That again, I don't want to stereotype this, because there women will do this as well. But more men than will take time during the day for those catch-ups, for those coffees. Whereas women will be more likely to be head down, get the work done, because they come in a bit later, they might leave a bit earlier, childcare, family responsibilities, whatever it is. So I think that will help balance massively. So again, I know I've shared some negative data today, but these are some real positives I see and coming out of this, which I think is excellent. It's not just about men, women as well. It's about our different personalities. We should all be able to work in an environment that gets the best out of us. And full stop.
Yeah. The other thing I worry about a little bit is whether or not, and as we know, that not always, but statistically, women often do still bear a heavier portion of the domestic load, is that they will then opt to work from home because they can balance some of these more domestic duties without a commute, and that men will get to, a male partner, for example, will go in and do those social things and drive, therefore technically drive through their career further. And as we know, statistically, that often is the case. So I do worry that it'll be like, well, I'll work from home and be here when the plumber comes and the kids get home from school and do the washing, but still work, you know, all of that's in my lunch break or however your office plays it or your workplace plays it. So I do worry that will be a sort of us and them. And then, you know, we all know that I'm not a proponent of presenteeism in terms of management whatsoever, but on the flip side, I'm very much a proponent of learning from others, as I keep mentioning, in person. So I do worry that will become a sort of us and them.
That sounds like another reason for after work drinks, it sounds like, everyone on the call today.
Yes.
I think we'll meet at the pub the next time. It's related as well to our conversation now around changes in the workplace. My colleague Sanoop has asked, what do you think as a priority should we change post-COVID within workplaces for women then? What priorities? And it's very timely at Peabody and so many other workplaces at the moment that are transitioning, refurbishing, letting go of buildings.
Totally. So this, I'll start this off, and it's not gender specific, but it does become gender specific. One of the big things is that it's going to be very rare that a meeting that previously, prior to COVID, would have happened face-to-face and has now happened virtually for the last year, will go back to being entirely face-to-face. It's very, very likely that almost every meeting will require at least one or two people dialing in, because as that trust snaps back the other way to, well, you can design as and what works for you, as it should, it's very rare that, unless you sort of do a team day, so we're all going to come in on Wednesdays or whatever. So absolutely, from a design perspective, needing those far more of those spaces to have those tech-enabled rooms, Zoom rooms, whatever you want to call them. I think Zoom room will catch on very quickly, I suspect. And so that does play into one side of things. But I think the other thing is just generally having the appropriate spaces for all the things that we know really help in terms of women's progress and learning from others, knowledge share, all that sort of thing. So the breakout spaces, the ability to have them so that people don't feel like they have to go off site to have those casual conversations, the overhearing, et cetera, being able to sort of duck out with privacy or without if it's not needed, and make those impromptu decisions. Now, that's not specifically gender-based. And to be honest, I don't think, to answer that question, they do need to be all that gender-based. I think women will benefit from those and what they offer equally to men.
Yeah, I guess on your point there though, and in relation to Jaqueline's point earlier around the fact that we need to double up our efforts currently to be able to get to a point where there's actually going to gender equality. And so on your suggestion actually makes me think, as co-chair of the Gender Network, how we need to formalize some of those digital ways where women can get mentoring, have have the sort of informal learning that you're talking about, because if they're missing out on it, and we actually need to work twice as hard, and if we don't formalize it and get it resourced, it won't really happen.
Yeah. The other thing is that previously people, they might have observed their workplace, but now it's far more heightened in terms of the experience that it offers, and having sufficient behaviorally, having sufficient spaces to be able to, and nearby spaces. You don't want to walk awkwardly with someone to sort of the other side of the floor for those sorts of conversations, to be able to duck in and out of throughout the day that provide entire confidentiality and privacy is particularly crucial, because you often do see people, but particularly women, more uncomfortable around those sorts of conversations in an open environment. Obviously there's very brazen women as well, so that's not necessarily a correlation, but yeah, absolutely having those available for, exactly as you say, the mentoring, the coaching, etc., which for men often does happen in those more direct environments.
Yeah, I love the idea of having a dedicated coaching or mentoring room where it's all sort of designed around growth. I don't know if Jaqueline, if you had anything to add there.
Yes, I do think that, I mean, again, this is something where research, the data doesn't really help us, because I think it was probably 30 years ago, the research was done on how we learn. And the percentage they said was that 70% of the learning was done on the job, 20% was done, and then 10 was through training. And that's how they kind of did their 70-20-10. However, what the research didn't ever share was that was men they asked, and men they did the data on, because this is old data. And so actually the question is that, yeah, how do women get supported? Because women don't learn 70% on the job. They really don't. Because if they did, it doesn't add up. And certainly the experience I've had coaching with the last 10 years, they actually say they really struggle to learn on the job, on the day, because as you were saying, Maddie, they don't have the sort of informal kind of sessions, coaching, mentoring, etc. So yeah, I do think that almost as part of a structure, of management structure, that, adding it into the layer of things and saying, okay, fine, so on the team, who's missing out on that day-to-day contact, and how do we replace that? How can we make it easy for them? So yes, creating a space to go where you say, okay, you get, we'll give you an hour each week, with a team member of your choice or a person of your choice, where you want to meet that person and find out more about what they do. And so actually put it a little bit more of a formal structure in place, so that women do get the opportunity to meet up with others. But as I said, the informal structure isn't working for women on the most part. It does need to have some sort of formality. So yeah, anything that makes that easier and makes it something that's done in the same way going to the water cooler is done, going to get a coffee together is done. It's something that becomes sort of a habitual, normal part of the day is definitely a positive.
I think you've already answered some of this question, Jaqueline, but there's one for you from my colleague, Miko Schneider, who's actually our staff engagement manager. And Miko's doing a lot of work leading on our new way of working remotely, and also what how our new office will look like. And she's asked, from an organizational development perspective, how can we facilitate a more flexible, gender balanced employee experience? And I know both of you already touched on this in different ways. And actually it makes me wonder the benefit of conducting quite a formal gender review of our new policy and our new approach with this exact lens that we've been exploring today.
Yes, because the policies are great and they need to be there without a doubt. But actually the next step is who's using them. Because if you have policies in place, and this came out, we looked at the Scandinavian countries, they seem to be further ahead than we are in the UK. I think it's 4 out of 5, or is it 3 out of 5 of the Scandinavian countries have female prime ministers. In fact, Sweden's the only one that hasn't had a female prime minister to date. So they're seen as being further ahead of us, and they have done things like equal parent leave, rather than parental leave, rather than maternity leave. They've done all that. However, what they found was that men weren't taking it up. So whilst the parental leave was there, so after the birth of a child, either parent could take off as much time, or, I don't know the ins and outs of each country, but that was there. The take-up wasn't there. And so then what they then turned around was they enforced it. They said, if you have a child, then as a parent, you are told you have to take this time off. And that's when things started to change. So the policies are great. That's the first step. But I think the second step is actually who is benefiting from these policies, who's using these policies. Because if we still have women leaving the workforce and taking benefit of these policies and men are not, then we still have the imbalance.
Like that reminds me of quite a depressing statistic that I'm familiar with in Australia, which is that the proportion of men who take up parental leave for their first child is actually quite high, and it plummets for their second, because they know how much work is involved to being at home with a baby, and by the time they have a second, it'll be another child. I found that incredibly depressing, and I'm sure it's probably quite similar in the UK.
But even the language that gets used around that as well. I mean, people refer to maternity leave still as time off. I mean, anybody who's had a child tell you it is not time off. It's the minute you have a child, you have a job for life that is 24/7. Now, in what capacity is a 24/7 job for life time off? I don't know how anybody can put that in that wording. But no, I still hear people now saying, oh, well, that she doesn't have some time off. And I'm like, what, maternity leave? It's like, no, it does. Yeah,
I've actually got a bit of a confession to make. When I was a graduate, Maddie and I were graduates together in the same program. This was sort of within the first couple of months of me working, my first office job. And one of my colleagues who works part-time said to me, oh yeah, I've got Friday, I don't work on Fridays. And I looked at her and I said, oh, what are you gonna do? You're gonna go to the movies? And she looked at me and she was like, no, Yvonne, I've got things to do at home. And I was so embarrassed. I just I hadn't to go, for me, if I had Fridays off, I would just be doing fun things. But she's, got children, she's got a household to run. And it just, I've never forgotten it since. And I was very embarrassed.
A long time ago now, Yvonne. Look at you now, co-chairing the network.
So one of my colleagues, Sheila, has asked on the topic of working mothers, do you agree that working mothers have been overloaded and could be better supported because of the unpaid roles that they do at home? Homeschooling has been demanding 3 hours a day, which again, I can't even imagine homeschooling someone 3 hours a day. And no extra cost for school lunches that kids usually get at school, reception. So all of the kind of challenges, I think it sounds like, that parents, particularly mothers, are experiencing. I think Sheila's question might be, how can we better support mums?
The issue here, though, is always, I know it's not easy. I know what I'm about to share, sounds like it's tough, but we have to value ourselves and our contribution first. Nobody else will value what we bring if we don't do it, which is why I want to share that £1.5 million number. If that's more close to, what your income is, and if you are in the situation where you're at home with you've got, a male partner, and raising children, that is your value. And when you wake up in the morning, almost put it on the mirror in lipstick and remind yourself every morning, that is what I am worth. Because every time you take a greater share of homeschooling, every time you do more of the washing, the whatever it is, every time you're telling everybody else you're not worth that. That's not what I'm worth. I'm only worth the job. So let's just put it as my background's investment banking. So quick numbers. £50,000 a year, let's say there's 50 weeks in the year for argument's sake, £1,000 a week, £200 a day, 8 hours a day, £25 an hour. That's what you essentially are worth. Those tasks that you're doing are worth zero. So you're sending your time at zero. Even if your partner's earning more than you, say they're earning, and obviously it tends to be in opposite gender couples, the man is earning more for a number of reasons. One, they tend to be older. I believe the average age difference in the UK is currently 3 years, I think, between men and women, which is about standard. So they've got 3 more years experience in working with you, so 3 years longer in their career. They won't have taken, not everybody listening to the call today will have children, but even if you don't, when it comes to it, the last time I looked, only women can have babies, when it comes to it. Either we have them or another woman has them for us. It's not like we can, decide that between ourselves, which one is having the baby. We have to have it. We take the time afterwards to care for the child before we can return to the workplace. So we are going to be behind in that way. So say your partner earns, say, £65,000 a year. So put that back down into a week, say 50 weeks again, 1,300 into a day, 260 into an hour, that's just over £31. So for them to do that job as well, they're doing zero. So why is it you at £25 an hour can do a £0 an hour job, but at £32 an hour they can't? We're talking about marginal differences here. You're both doing a job that's way below your pay grade. So think about that. Also think about the example you give your own children. And I will share a personal example, because one of the best things I think I've ever done is actually be the worst possible cook. I am absolutely rubbish in the kitchen. The kitchen hates me. If you could imagine the kitchen were a cat, it would like almost at me when I walk in. It's like, what is she doing here? She's completely incompetent. Don't let her touch me. But it's one of the best things I did, because actually it turns out that my husband actually has always been a good cook, and actually has become a much better cook over our 25 years, because thankfully I've kindly allowed him to increase his abilities and to develop his abilities, which means he does a lot of the work. Now I have a daughter and a son. Guess which one cooks with him? Quick answer, it's not my daughter. My son cooks with him. My son over furlough, he's 18 now, so I had the bad news of having to wake him up in the morning, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. Getting a teenager out of bed is the closest thing to hell as I can ever imagine, quite frankly. But the upside was he would make lunch. He'd say, Mum, the burgers are ready, come through. I had my lunch made by my 18-year-old because his father set that example. My daughter will do everything she can to avoid cooking. So we set the example at home. So it really does. And this book that I really recommend people get is Good Guys, how men can help. We can help them because they can set that example. And if they are now doing more of the care at home, they will be demanding the workplace changes as well. It becomes a human issue. It becomes a parenting issue. We move away from it being a female issue.
Absolutely. I've put the chat a link to the book in the chat, actually.
So well done.
We've got 10 minutes left, and I think I might cover 2 more questions. The first we haven't touched on in either presentations, but perhaps you might like to comment, either of you. Have Black women or women of colour been disproportionately affected during the pandemic in terms of their work? I don't know if either of you have come across any study or research on this topic.
There's a lot more in the US than there is over here. That much I can tell you. There's not that much over here. In the US, there's a pecking order. Let's just take gender pay gap, for example. There is a pecking order. So obviously, white men earn the most. Then behind them, yes, it definitely is. I mean, there's an order obviously for men as well. So it's not just ethnicity for gender. Ethnicity works on either male or female. But then white women behind is then followed by, I mean, the Americans in their report refer this to Latinas or the Latin population, and then they're next, and then the last is, how they refer to as African American women. So there's a big difference. So when it comes to pay in itself, yes, white women fare better than their sisters of differing backgrounds and colours, which is incredibly sad. But this is something else that we also need to make sure that we are doing, that we don't leave our sisters behind us. This is also part of the battle that we all have to fight. I was actually quite sad to read, I hadn't realised this, but when women got the vote over 100 years ago in the various countries, it was white women that got the vote to begin with. Again, it was then, and it took, I think it was the US, I think it was 12 years later. I can't remember the data exactly, but again, you can all look this up, but it was later. And I was devastated to see that. Hadn't even occurred to me to ask the question. When I heard women got the vote, I thought it meant women. And I know to begin with it was women over 30, because under 30 their brains weren't developed enough to be able to take such a big decision, was the reason given. And then it became 25, and then finally we got parity when it came to the voting age. Never even occurred to me to look and say, hang on a minute, when they say women, was it all women? Which I was almost quite upset with myself for, actually, not even thinking to ask that question. And it was just on some research I did that I was sitting at my computer, and I just went, oh, I didn't know it. And I was really shocked and upset to find that. So we cannot let this happen. We really cannot. And that's a responsibility that we all have too. We can't turn around and say, oh, well, I didn't know, but we have that responsibility too. Yeah,
very definitely. I've got 2 more questions. I think we can probably cover them both in the final 8 minutes. One of them is from Sophie Carrick, and it's, why do you think females make up informal sectors as a general rule? I can make a comment that in terms of Peabody, quite a large part of our workforce is made of people who work in care and support roles. And traditionally, care roles so caring for another person, it's a highly gendered activity. Little girls right from a young age get dolls to play with that you take care of. And that sort of caring nature is so ingrained and so gendered that it plays out well into adulthood in terms of the education choices you make, your teaching degrees, nursing degrees, both dominated by women, rather than engineering, say. And then that's then reflected in some of the sectors. It's not necessarily reflected in every sector. So my understanding, say in hospitality or retail, not necessarily gendered in terms of your childhood, but it is in that they tend to be more flexible sectors. And so if you have care and responsibilities, it's a lot easier to do shift hours. It might be easier for you to work a Saturday morning and school hours on Thursdays and Wednesdays. And they often attract more women because of the flexibility. But flexibility comes because of that. Usually you get fewer benefits and it's much more uncertain work, and you're much more likely to be at risk of redundancy, which is what we've seen happen from the pandemic as well. So that's sort of my take on that. I don't know if either of you would like to comment.
No, I think you're spot on there, Yvonne. I would do something very similar.
Yeah, no, and it's something that it's one of those things I've considered a lot as a working person. It was, I think, there are some truths that you discover as an adult, and one of them was the gendered nature of work. And for me, I was just like, why is it like this? It's so strange to me that it's like this. It's so strange to me that it's perpetuated. Women do not make better teachers. Women do not make better nurses. Why is it that we're overrepresented? And why is it that some of the most important jobs in our communities are so poorly paid? And the pandemic has really shone light on that. Some of the most important work in the community that our lives couldn't continue without them. So many of them are done by women, and yet so many of them are so undervalued and so underpaid. I'm not going to finish on that note.
No, I was just going to say it does also go back to the my mum's a teacher, and ironically my younger sister has also become a teacher, and I was having a conversation with my mum along these lines just at the weekend with International Women's Day. And like the story of many people in her generation, she's in her late 60s, all she had, her only options were nursing or teaching, and she didn't like blood. So that was where it went. Obviously that's changed a lot in the decades since, but she's still frustrated to this day because she's retired 45 years of primary school teaching, but she still doesn't think it was what she should have done. So we have moved on, but luckily, thankfully, as a society, but still but that trend is still, my mum was a nurse, my sister was,
Yeah. But one last one for you, Jaqueline, very quickly. So if we need to double our efforts in workplace gender equality, what are some of the best things we can do? What will give us the biggest impact? And I think we've covered some of this already, but just to recap, I think this, from the perspective of the workplace, what sorts of things can we do as we look to move on from the pandemic?
I think the one thing that is repeated, and it's why I do what I do, it's the one thing that's repeated no matter what report you look at, whether it's McKinsey, PwC, the one factor that always shows up when it's how can we progress this quicker, the one is training. It is training, because we know that women are losing out on training in the workplace. They're going to lose out even more now because of the fact that the virtual environment means that you're less likely to get access to people, etc., etc. So the training is really important, and it reminds me of an old a phrase that was said. Don't when you're trying to support an impoverished nation, you don't give them fish. You teach them how to fish, and you give them the power. You empower them, and empowering women is so important. And I know from the data and the stats that we do that there's an awful lot out there which I think is misleading. There's this view that women lack confidence and that's why they don't excel in the workplace. That's not the feedback we get from in the last 5 years. There's been over 5,000 women through the program from various countries, various companies, various industries, various ages as well. And when we ask the questions about their confidence, they come back with good confidence levels. What they're lacking is the day-to-day of what can be called office politics. But office politics are just dealing with people. It's human interactions. The problem that most women have is that the way they see their male counterparts operate, they just don't want to do it that way. And I couldn't agree more. There are better ways. I think there are better ways of doing this. And I think these better ways are also a 21st century leadership model that we should all be aspiring to. So it shouldn't just be, we should all be converging into this almost this central way of operating. And I think there are ways that, interventions that need to be handled from the male side of converging that leadership style to the 21st century paradigm. And I think there's also, from the female side, the training to get them there. So they do, from that mid-level point, they do know, actually, I can do this. I mean, I've lost count on the webinars when we've had the feedback and people said, didn't know it was this easy. Didn't know it was this easy. It is so much easier. I cannot tell you, it's so much easier. What we share, these are small little tricks. There's nothing wrong with how any of us are operating in the environment, but there are small little tricks that just get us over the line. And that few percentage, differences, it makes a world of difference. It just gets us over the line. So for me, really, it's training, and it's rolling out the right training so that women understand the power they have, understand the way they can contribute better, and know how to bring that contribution to the table. But also the flip side is that we are also, for everybody, we're moving towards a 21st century leadership paradigm, because the old command control style is not the way we want to be. I don't think anyway. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. We've got a minute left, so just thank you both so much. I really, really enjoyed the long Q&A. I much preferred, and about you, I mean, there's a time and a place for webinars where you listen to information, but it's so enjoyable to have conversation and to have people ask questions as well. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everyone today for joining as well. There's a recording of this if you missed the beginning. And just to leave on a more hopeful note as well, because I know we've covered a lot of negative information and data, and the reason that we put on this session today, in part to mark International Women's Day, but also so that we can start to think about what are the impacts of this pandemic, and how can we do better? How can we go to a place, move forward in our work, in our lives, that's going to be more positive, more productive, and where we feel more fulfilled? I know there are big asks, but what's the point otherwise? And I really hope that, through activities like this, and together, the Gender Network, we do a lot of work with LNOD and with HR to help feedback on policies and ways that we can improve our culture to make it a more inclusive place for everyone, particularly for women who, as we've seen today, have really experienced much greater challenges from the pandemic. But thank you again both for joining us, Jaqueline and Madeleine.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's been really lovely.